Tonight, we journey into the dark underbelly of maritime history, where the romanticized tales of swashbuckling adventure give way to a grim reality that would challenge every fiber of your being. We're exploring the authentic, unvarnished truth about pirate life during the Golden Age of Piracy. Spanning from the 1650s to the 1730s, this isn't the sanitized version Hollywood has fed you, with dashing captains and noble rogues sailing into sunset adventures. This is the story of desperate men trapped in floating coffins, where death stalked every deck, disease ravaged every crew, and survival required a brutality that most of us can barely imagine. The life of a pirate was, quite simply, a slow-motion death sentence wrapped in the false promise of freedom and fortune. While popular culture has painted these seafaring outlaws as romantic figures fighting against oppression, the historical record tells a far different story. It speaks of young men, mostly under 30, who chose a path that virtually guaranteed their death within 2 years. It chronicles a world where the average life expectancy plummeted to around 26 years, where daily existence meant living in conditions that would horrify modern prisoners, and where the pursuit of treasure often led to nothing more than an early grave. So, before we dive into these treacherous waters, take a moment to appreciate the warmth of your home, the safety of your surroundings, and the simple luxury of knowing where your next meal will come from. Because once we begin this journey, you'll understand why the romanticized pirate life is nothing more than fiction, and why the reality would break even the strongest among us. The men who turned to piracy weren't born criminals seeking adventure on the high seas. They were products of a brutal age where legitimate maritime work often meant signing what amounted to a death warrant. Royal Navy sailors faced impressment, where young men were essentially kidnapped and forced into service with no promise of return. Merchant sailors endured back-breaking labor for pittance wages, often going months without pay, while their employers grew rich from their suffering. Life expectancy for pressed naval sailors was a mere 2 years, and conditions were so harsh that desertion rates soared, despite the penalty being death by hanging. Against this backdrop, piracy seemed like liberation. It offered the promise of democratic governance, fair division of spoils, and escape from the iron-fisted discipline of legitimate service. Pirates elected their captains and could vote them out of office. They established written codes that governed behavior and ensured equitable treatment. The loot from captured vessels was divided according to agreed-upon shares, with even the lowest crew member receiving compensation that dwarfed what they could earn as honest sailors. But this apparent freedom came at a cost that few fully understood when they made their choice. The moment a man raised a black flag, he crossed a line from which there was no return. He became an outlaw, hunted by every naval force, wanted dead or alive by every colonial government, and marked for execution should he ever be captured. The very freedom that drew them to piracy became their prison, as they could never again walk freely in civilized society without risk of immediate arrest and execution. The tragic irony of pirate life becomes clear when we examine the statistics. While pirates enjoyed better food, fairer treatment, and democratic governance compared to their legitimate counterparts, their life expectancy was actually lower than that of Royal Navy sailors. The constant threat of capture, the violence inherent in their profession, and the diseases that spread like wildfire in their close quarters created a perfect storm of mortality that claimed lives at an alarming rate. Disease and death, the silent killers. The greatest enemy of pirates was unrivaled crews or naval hunters. It was the invisible army of diseases that turned every ship into a floating charnel house. Modern audiences, accustomed to antibiotics and basic hygiene, can barely comprehend the bacterial and viral horrors that awaited every man who set foot on a pirate vessel. These microscopic killers claimed more pirate lives than all the sword fights and cannon battles combined, transforming dreams of treasure and freedom into nightmares of suffering and slow death. Scurvy stood as the undisputed king of maritime death, claiming an estimated 2 million sailors between 1500 and 1800. This vitamin C deficiency disease didn't simply weaken its victims, it systematically dismantled their bodies, piece by piece. The earliest symptoms appeared deceptively mild: fatigue, joint pain, and a general malaise that many attributed to the hardships of sea life. But scurvy was just beginning its cruel work. As the disease progressed, pirates watched in horror as their gums swelled and began bleeding constantly. Their breath became putrid as their teeth loosened and fell out one by one, making eating an agonizing ordeal. Old wounds that had long since healed would mysteriously reopen, bleeding freely as if the injuries had just occurred. Their skin developed a sickly pale complexion marked by dark spots and easy bruising that turned their bodies into patchworks of purple and black. But the true horror of scurvy lay in its final stages. Bones that had been broken years earlier would suddenly snap again without warning, as the disease dissolved the calcium that held them together. Internal hemorrhaging caused blood to pool in joints and muscles, creating excruciating pain that no amount of rum could dull. The lucky ones died quickly when bleeding in vital organs finally overwhelmed their systems. The unlucky lingered for weeks, their bodies slowly consuming themselves as they awaited death. The tragic irony was that scurvy was entirely preventable. Fresh citrus fruits could cure the disease within days, but pirates rarely had access to such luxury items. Their limited storage space was reserved for weapons, ammunition, and the preserved foods that formed their basic sustenance. Even when they raided ships carrying fresh provisions, the perishable items were typically consumed immediately, leaving nothing for the long voyages that followed. Yellow fever brought its own unique brand of terror to the Caribbean waters that pirates called home. This mosquito-borne disease earned its name from the jaundiced complexion it gave its victims. But the yellow skin was merely the visible sign of internal organs shutting down one by one. The disease began with what seemed like a mild fever, easily mistaken for the common ailments that plagued all sailors. Pirates suffering from yellow fever initially experienced headaches, chills, and muscle aches that they often attributed to hard work and poor sleep. Within days, however, the true nature of the disease revealed itself. The fever spiked to dangerous levels, causing delirium and hallucinations that left grown men babbling like children or screaming at enemies only they could see. Their skin and the whites of their eyes took on the characteristic yellow tinge as their liver began failing. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the black vomita, mixture of blood and bile that indicated internal bleeding was destroying their digestive system. Yellow fever killed roughly half of those it infected, making it a more immediate threat than scurvy, but equally deadly in its own way. The disease showed no preference for age, strength, or experience. It could strike down a seasoned captain as easily as a young recruit, and its rapid progression meant that entire crews could be decimated within weeks of the first infection. Malaria presented yet another nightmare scenario for pirates operating in tropical waters. Unlike yellow fever's quick strike, malaria was a patient killer that took its time destroying its victims. The disease began with cyclical fevers that came and went with clockwork regularity. Every 2 or 3 days, pirates afflicted with malaria would experience sudden, violent chills that left them shaking uncontrollably despite the tropical heat. These chills would be followed by burning fevers that soaked their clothes with sweat and left them delirious. The cruel aspect of malaria was its persistence. Even if pirates survived the initial infection, the disease would remain dormant in their bloodstream, ready to return whenever their immune system weakened. Stress, poor nutrition, or other illnesses could trigger new attacks, creating a cycle of suffering that could last for years. The recurring fevers left pirates weak and anemic, unable to perform the physical tasks that shipboard life demanded. Smallpox represented perhaps the most visually horrifying disease that pirates encountered. This viral infection began, innocuously enough, with fever and body aches that seemed minor compared to other shipboard ailments. But within days, the characteristic rash appeared, starting as small red spots that quickly evolved into fluid-filled blisters covering every inch of the victim's body. The blisters were not merely cosmetic, they were incredibly painful, making it agony for pirates to move, eat, or even lie down comfortably. As the disease progressed, the blisters filled with pus and merged together, creating massive oozing sores that covered the victim from head to toe. The lucky ones suffered from what doctors called ordinary smallpox, where the pustules remained separate and eventually burst and scabbed over. Those with confluent smallpox faced a more gruesome fate as the pustules merged together, literally peeling their skin away from their bodies in shock. Even survivors bore permanent reminders of their ordeal. The scabs left deep, disfiguring pits in the skin that marked smallpox survivors for life. Many were left blind from lesions that formed on their eyes, while others suffered brain damage from the high fevers. In a world where physical appearance could mean the difference between acceptance and rejection in port towns, these scars effectively branded former smallpox victims as damaged goods. Dysentery, that scourge of crowded, unsanitary conditions, turned pirate ships into floating sewers. This bacterial infection of the intestines caused bloody diarrhea that quickly led to dehydration and death if left untreated. Pirates suffering from dysentery experienced constant, painful cramping as their intestines became inflamed and ulcerated. The frequent, bloody bowel movements meant that victims could rarely stray far from the ship's primitive toilet facilities, leaving them unable to perform their duties and making them burdens to their crewmates. The disease spread with horrifying speed through the close quarters of a pirate ship. Contaminated water, spoiled food, and poor sanitation created perfect conditions for bacterial growth. Since pirates had no understanding of bacterial transmission, they unknowingly spread the disease through their standard practices of sharing eating utensils, drinking from common water barrels, and using the same primitive washing facilities. Tuberculosis presented a more insidious threat, slowly consuming its victims from within over months or years. This bacterial infection primarily attacked the lungs, causing a persistent, racking cough that grew progressively worse over time. Pirates with tuberculosis would cough up blood and pus, their breathing becoming labored and painful as the disease destroyed lung tissue. The constant coughing fits left them exhausted and weak, unable to maintain the physical stamina that pirate life demanded. The disease earned its nickname as consumption because it literally consumed its victims, causing dramatic weight loss as their bodies fought a losing battle against the infection. Pirates watched helplessly as their crewmates wasted away, their skin taking on a pale, translucent quality that made them appear almost ghostly. The close quarters and shared air of ship life meant that tuberculosis could infect entire crews, creating a slow-motion epidemic that claimed lives over months rather than weeks. Floating hell. Life aboard a pirate ship. The pirate ship itself was far from the romantic vessel of adventure that popular culture depicts. These floating prisons were cramped, dark, and pestilential environments where basic human dignity became a luxury that few could afford. Most pirate vessels were captured merchant ships or naval vessels that had been modified for their new purpose. But these modifications prioritized firepower and storage over crew comfort. The result was a claustrophobic nightmare where personal space was measured in inches rather than feet. The crew's quarters, typically located in the lower deck, represented humanity at its most compressed. Each pirate was allocated a sleeping space, approximately 12 to 18 inches wide, barely enough room for a grown man to lie flat without touching his neighbors. These spaces weren't private cabins or even individual bunks, but simply designated areas on wooden platforms or hammocks strung so close together that rolling over in sleep meant bumping into the person next to you. Privacy became a forgotten concept in these conditions. Pirates ate, slept, dressed, and conducted all their personal business in full view of their crewmates. The psychological stress of never being alone, combined with the physical discomfort of the cramped conditions, created an atmosphere of tension that could explode into violence at any moment. Arguments over sleeping space, accusations of stealing room, and conflicts over snoring or restless sleep became sources of serious disputes that sometimes ended in bloodshed. The air in the lower decks was thick and fetid, a toxic mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, bilge water, and human waste. With minimal ventilation and no understanding of air circulation, these spaces became repositories for every foul odor produced by dozens of men living in close proximity. The smell was so overwhelming that even experienced sailors often became nauseous when first entering the crew quarters. Lighting in these spaces was minimal and dangerous. Candles and oil lamps represented fire hazards on wooden ships loaded with gunpowder, so most of the time, pirates lived in near total darkness below decks. This perpetual gloom added to the oppressive atmosphere, making the crew quarters feel more like a tomb than a living space. Pirates often developed eye problems from straining to see in the poor light, and accidents were common as men stumbled through the darkness trying to navigate around sleeping or resting crewmates. The ship's head, the primitive toilet facilities, represented one of the most degrading aspects of pirate ship life. Located at the bow of the ship, where the forward motion would theoretically carry waste away from the vessel. The head consisted of little more than wooden planks with holes cut through them. Pirates were forced to relieve themselves while sitting over these holes, with their waste dropping directly into the ocean below. During storms or rough weather, using the head became a genuinely dangerous activity. The combination of wet, slippery surfaces and the ship's violent motion meant that pirates risked being thrown overboard while answering nature's call. Many chose to use chamber pots during bad weather, but this created additional problems when the contents had to be disposed of later. The communal nature of the head meant that privacy was impossible even during these most personal moments. Pirates often had to wait in line to use the facilities, and the lack of any barrier between the holes meant that multiple men might be forced to sit side by side while relieving themselves. This degrading experience became just another aspect of shipboard life that gradually wore down the mental resilience of the crew. Personal hygiene became virtually impossible under these conditions. Fresh water was far too precious to waste on washing, being reserved strictly for drinking and cooking. Pirates rarely bathed except when they fell overboard or during the occasional rainstorm that caught them on deck. When they did attempt to wash, it was usually with seawater, which left their skin sticky with salt and provided little actual cleaning benefit. Their clothes became repositories for months of accumulated filth, sweat, and grime. Pirates typically owned only the clothes they wore, with perhaps one spare set if they were fortunate. These garments were worn until they literally fell apart, becoming increasingly dirty, smelly, and pest-infested over time. The lack of soap or proper washing facilities meant that clothing could never be truly cleaned, only rinsed with seawater that often left them stiffer and more uncomfortable than before. Personal grooming became a crude affair, conducted with whatever tools pirates could obtain or improvise. Haircuts were performed by crewmates using whatever sharp instruments were available, often resulting in uneven hacked-off styles that would be shocking by modern standards. Shaving required skill with a straight razor while the ship pitched and rolled, leading many pirates to grow beards simply because the alternative was too dangerous. The constant motion of the ship created additional challenges for daily life. Simple tasks like eating, sleeping, or even walking became exercises in balance and timing. Pirates had to time their movements with the ship's roll, learning to eat quickly before their food slid off their plates, and to sleep while braced against the ship's motion. Seasickness was a constant companion for many, adding nausea and vomiting to the already overwhelming list of physical discomforts. Rats were unwelcome but inevitable passengers on every pirate ship. These rodents thrived in the dark, food-rich environment of the ship's hold, multiplying rapidly and spreading throughout the vessel. They contaminated food stores, chewed through ropes and canvas, and carried diseases that could spread to the crew. Pirates often woke to find rats running across their bodies, or discovered that the creatures had chewed holes in their clothes or personal belongings. The presence of rats created a secondary problem in the form of catandrat warfare throughout the ship. While cats were sometimes brought aboard specifically to control rodent populations, they often became just another source of noise, odor, and mess in the already crowded conditions. The ongoing battle between cats and rats created additional chaos in spaces that were already difficult to navigate. Insects presented another constant source of misery for pirates. Lice infested their hair and clothing, causing constant itching and skin irritation. Fleas thrived in the filthy conditions, biting exposed skin and making sleep nearly impossible. In tropical waters, mosquitoes swarmed aboard ships at night, carrying the diseases that would eventually kill many crew members while making their lives miserable in the short term. The psychological impact of these conditions cannot be overstated. Pirates lived in a state of constant sensory assault, bombarded by foul smells, disturbing sights, uncomfortable temperatures, and irritating sounds around the clock. The lack of personal space meant that conflicts between crewmates were inevitable, and the absence of privacy made it impossible to escape or decompress from the stress of shipboard life. Mental health problems were common but unrecognized. Pirates suffering from what we would now identify as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress had no understanding of these conditions and no treatment options available. Many turned to alcohol as their only escape, but the limited supplies meant that even this relief was often unavailable. The result was a crew of men operating under constant psychological pressure, always on the edge of breakdown or explosive violence. The horror of pirate food, the sustenance that kept pirates alive, barely deserved the name food. What passed for meals aboard pirate ships were desperate attempts to ward off starvation using whatever preserved provisions could survive months at sea without refrigeration. The romantic image of pirates feasting on exotic delicacies plundered from merchant vessels was a fantasy that bore no resemblance to the grim reality of maritime dining. Hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit, formed the foundation of every pirate's diet and represented everything wrong with eating at sea. These fearsomely durable squares of flour and water dough were baked until they achieved a consistency approaching stone, made from nothing but flour, water, and occasionally salt. Hardtack contained virtually no nutritional value beyond basic carbohydrates. The biscuits were deliberately created to last for years without spoiling, which meant they were baked until every trace of moisture was eliminated. The result was a food product that was virtually inedible in its natural state. Pirates attempting to bite into hardtack risked breaking their teeth on the rock-hard surface. The standard procedure involved soaking the biscuits in whatever liquid was available: water, rum, coffee, or even seawater in desperate circumstances, until they softened enough to chew. Even then, the texture resembled soggy cardboard more than anything resembling actual bread. But the true horror of hardtack lay not in its taste or texture, but in the unwelcome protein it inevitably contained. The ship's stores provided perfect breeding grounds for weevils, small beetles that laid their eggs in the flour before the biscuits were baked. As the hardtack aged, these eggs hatched into larvae that literally ate their way through the biscuits, leaving them riddled with holes and filled with living insects. Pirates developed a grim routine for dealing with their weevil-infested food. They would knock the hardtack against a solid surface and wait for the insects to crawl out before eating what remained. Those lucky enough to have coffee or hot broth would submerge their biscuits and skim the weevils off the surface as they floated to the top. The less fortunate simply ate the insects along with their bread, reasoning that the additional protein was better than starvation. The psychological impact of eating weevil-infested food cannot be understated. These men were forced to confront their own desperation every time they sat down to eat. The knowledge that their basic sustenance was contaminated with insects served as a constant reminder of how far they had fallen from civilized life. Many pirates reported that they eventually stopped looking at their food closely, preferring to eat in darkness rather than see what they were consuming. Salted meat provided the primary source of protein in the pirate diet, but the preservation process rendered it barely recognizable as food. Beef and pork were packed in barrels with massive quantities of salt to prevent spoilage. But this process drew out all moisture and most of the flavor. The result was a product that resembled black oak more than meat, so hard and dry that it could literally be carved into buttons or belt buckles. The salt concentration required for preservation was so high that the meat became inedible without extensive preparation. Pirates had to soak salted meat for hours or even days to remove enough salt to make it palatable, a process that often left them with tasteless, stringy chunks that bore no resemblance to the fresh meat it had once been. The soaking process also created another problem. The water used to desalinate the meat became contaminated with salt and had to be discarded, wasting precious fresh water supplies. Even after proper preparation, the preserved meat was difficult to digest and provided limited nutritional value. The preservation process destroyed most vitamins and minerals, leaving only protein of questionable quality. Pirates who relied too heavily on salted meat often developed digestive problems and nutritional deficiencies that weakened their already compromised health. The ship's water supply represented another daily challenge that landlubbers could scarcely imagine. Fresh water, stored in wooden barrels for months at sea, quickly developed a slimy, algae-covered surface and a taste that defied description. The wooden barrels themselves contributed to the problem, leaching tannins and other compounds that made the water bitter and astringent. Without proper purification methods, bacteria and other microorganisms thrived in the stagnant water, creating a breeding ground for waterborne diseases. Pirates learned to hold their breath while drinking to avoid the smell, and many preferred to mix their water with rum or other alcoholic beverages to mask the taste. This practice led to additional problems with alcohol dependency and dehydration, as many pirates avoided drinking water altogether rather than face the nauseating experience of consuming their corrupted supplies. When food supplies ran dangerously low, pirates were forced to consume items that would horrify modern sensibilities. Leather goods belts, shoes, and equipment were cut up, soaked, beaten to soften them, and then boiled into a crude soup. The hair was scraped off and the leather roasted or grilled to make it as palatable as possible. But the result was still barely digestible and provided minimal nutrition. Cannibalism, while not common, was not unknown among desperate pirate crews. Historical accounts document instances where crews drew lots to determine who would be killed and eaten to keep the survivors alive. This practice, euphemistically called the custom of the sea, represented the absolute nadir of pirate existence, the point where civilized behavior collapsed entirely under the pressure of starvation. The psychological trauma of resorting to cannibalism left permanent scars on the survivors. Pirates who had participated in or witnessed such acts often suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares, guilt, and mental breakdowns that could last for years. The knowledge that they were capable of such extremes served as a constant reminder of how far they had fallen from humanity. Vitamin deficiencies created additional layers of suffering beyond the obvious symptoms of scurvy. Pirates suffered from night blindness, dental problems, digestive issues, and immune system failures that left them vulnerable to every disease they encountered. Their bodies, deprived of essential nutrients, began breaking down in ways both visible and invisible. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant that pirates missed out on hundreds of essential micronutrients that modern science has identified as crucial for human health. Their diet, consisting almost entirely of processed, preserved foods, provided calories but little else. This nutritional poverty showed itself in poor wound healing, frequent illnesses, premature aging, and general physical weakness that made every aspect of pirate life more difficult. Cooking aboard ship presented its own unique challenges that further degraded the quality of an already poor diet. With limited fuel and constant fire hazards, most food preparation consisted of boiling everything together in large communal pots. This one-pot cooking method destroyed whatever vitamins might have survived the preservation process and created meals that were uniformly tasteless and nutritionally empty. The communal nature of ship cooking also meant that individual dietary needs or preferences were impossible to accommodate. Pirates with digestive problems, food allergies, or religious dietary restrictions had no choice but to eat whatever was prepared for the entire crew or go hungry. This forced consumption of inappropriate foods often led to additional health problems that compounded the already dire state of pirate nutrition. Violence and brutality. The violence that permeated pirate life extended far beyond the romantic sword fights depicted in popular culture. It was a constant, grinding reality that touched every aspect of their existence. From the savage battles with merchant ships to the internal conflicts that could explode without warning among crewmates, the brutality practiced by and against pirates represented humanity at its most savage, where mercy was a luxury few could afford, and survival depended on the willingness to inflict or endure unimaginable suffering. Pirate attacks on merchant vessels were exercises in calculated terror designed to break the will of their victims as quickly as possible. The goal was simply to seize cargo. It was to create such overwhelming fear that future victims would surrender without resistance. Pirates understood that their reputation for brutality was as valuable as any weapon in their arsenal. So they cultivated images of themselves as inhuman monsters capable of any atrocity. The boarding of a ship began with psychological warfare. Pirates would fire warning shots and hoist their black flags while screaming threats and brandishing weapons in the most intimidating manner possible. They deliberately created chaos and confusion, using noise, smoke, and aggressive posturing to make their force appear larger and more dangerous than it actually was. The goal was to terrorize the merchant crew into immediate surrender, avoiding the costs and risks of actual combat. When merchants chose to resist, the violence that followed was swift and merciless. Pirates used every weapon at their disposal, cutlasses, pistols, clubs, and improvised weapons, to overwhelm their opponents through sheer brutality. But the violence didn't end when resistance ceased. Pirates often inflicted additional punishment on crews who had dared to fight back, viewing such resistance as a personal insult that demanded retribution. The torture methods employed by pirates were designed to extract information about hidden valuables while simultaneously serving as examples to other potential victims. These pirate persuasions were sophisticated techniques of physical and psychological abuse that demonstrated a disturbing understanding of human suffering. Pirates would tie cords around captives' heads and tighten them until their eyes literally bulged out of their skulls, a technique borrowed from earlier buccaneers and refined through years of practice. Burning was another favored method of extracting information. Pirates would place lit matches between their victims' fingers, holding them there while the flesh burned away to the bone. They would heat metal tools until they glowed red hot, then apply them to sensitive areas of the body, creating burns that would never fully heal. The smell of burning flesh and the screams of the tortured served to break the will of other captives who witnessed these atrocities. Some pirates elevated torture to an art form that revealed the depths of human sadism. Edward Lowe, known as one of the cruelest pirates of the era, would cut off the ears and noses of his captives, forcing them to watch as he cooked these body parts and made other prisoners eat them. His treatment of a Portuguese captain became legendary in its horror. Lowe cut off the man's lips, cooked them in front of him, and then forced the mutilated officer to consume his own flesh while his wounds bled freely. Francois Lalonde, the French pirate known for his pathological hatred of Spaniards, demonstrated the complete absence of human empathy that characterized the most violent pirates. When Spanish prisoners refused to provide information about safe routes through Central America, Lalonde cut open the chest of one man with his cutlass, tore out the still beating heart, and bit into it while the victim watched his own heart being consumed. This act of cannibalistic savagery was uncommitted in the heat of battle or under extreme circumstances. It was a calculated act of terrorism designed to break the will of the remaining prisoners. Henry Morgan, later knighted by the British Crown for his services against Spanish colonies, employed techniques that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. His favorite method of extracting information was woodling, strapping leather cords around prisoners' foreheads and tightening them with metal bars until the pressure caused their eyeballs to pop from their skulls. This technique was particularly effective because it left victims alive but permanently disfigured, serving as living reminders of Morgan's brutality to anyone who encountered them later. The violence wasn't limited to enemy cruise pirates, were equally brutal toward each other when circumstances demanded it. Pirate codes, while providing some protection for crew members, also prescribed savage punishments for those who violated the ship's articles. Desertion, theft from fellow crew members, and cowardice in battle were all capital offenses that could result in execution or marooning. Marooning represented perhaps the cruelest punishment that pirates could inflict on their own crew members. The condemned pirate would be abandoned on a small, uninhabited island with only a pistol, some gunpowder, and a bottle of water. This wasn't simply exile, it was a slow death sentence designed to maximize suffering. The marooned pirate would spend days or weeks slowly dying of thirst, starvation, or exposure, with the pistol providing the only escape from prolonged agony. The psychological impact of marooning extended beyond the victim to affect the entire crew. Pirates were forced to watch as their former crewmate was abandoned to certain death, knowing that they too could face the same fate if they violated the ship's code. This created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that poisoned relationships among crew members, as anyone could become an accuser or victim depending on circumstances. Flogging represented the standard punishment for lesser offenses, but even this minor discipline could result in permanent injury or death. Pirates used the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip consisting of 9 knotted strands that could strip flesh from bone with each lash. The prescribed punishment was often 39 lashes, the maximum number that supposedly wouldn't kill a man, based on dubious biblical precedent. In practice, many pirates died from fewer lashes, while others survived far more. The primitive state of medical knowledge meant that many treatable conditions proved fatal simply because effective treatments hadn't been discovered yet. Appendicitis, which can be cured with modern surgery, was universally fatal. Infections that could be eliminated with antibiotics raged unchecked through the body until they killed their victims. Even minor cuts could develop into life-threatening conditions if they became infected in the unsanitary conditions aboard ship. Natural disasters and shipwrecks. The ocean itself was perhaps the most impartial and deadly enemy those pirates faced, showing no favoritism between lawful sailors and criminal crews when unleashing its fury. Natural disasters at sea claimed more pirate lives than all the naval battles and criminal executions combined, demonstrating that nature's violence far exceeded anything humans could devise. Pirates who survived diseases, combat, and brutal surgical procedures could still find themselves helpless against the raw power of storms, hurricanes, and the unforgiving sea. Storms at sea represented a unique form of terror that landlubbers could scarcely imagine. When weather systems developed into major tempests, pirate ships became tiny, fragile specks at the mercy of waves that could tower 60 feet or more above their decks. These massive walls of water would crash down with the force of avalanches, flooding the decks and threatening to drive the vessel beneath the surface permanently. The violence of storm winds could literally tear ships apart piece by piece. Sails would shred into ribbons, leaving pirates unable to control their vessel's direction or speed. Masts snapped under the pressure of wind and wave, often crushing crew members beneath tons of falling wood and rigging. The ship's hull, constantly flexed by the competing forces of wind and water, would develop cracks and leaks that let the sea pour into the lower decks where the crew took shelter. During major storms, the normal hierarchy and organization aboard pirate ships collapsed entirely. Officers and common sailors alike found themselves clinging to whatever handholds they could find, united only in their desperate struggle for survival. The democratic principles that governed pirate crews during normal times became irrelevant when faced with nature as assault. Survival depended entirely on individual endurance and luck. The psychological terror of storms was often worse than the physical danger. Pirates would spend hours or even days listening to their ship groan and crack under the assault of wind and waves, never knowing if the next impact would be the one that finally broke their vessel apart. The constant noise, howling wind, crashing waves, splintering wood, and screaming crew members created a sensory assault that could drive men to madness. Sleep became impossible during major storms, not just because of the ship's violent motion, but because lying down meant risking being thrown against bulkheads or crushed by shifting cargo. Pirates would wedge themselves into corners or lash themselves to solid structures, trying to find positions where they could survive the ship's wild gyrations without being seriously injured. Many sustained broken bones, concussions, and other injuries simply from being thrown around inside their own ship. Hurricanes represented the ultimate test of a pirate ship's seaworthiness and crew's endurance. These massive storm systems could maintain their assault for days, subjecting vessels to sustained winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and waves that defied comprehension. The experience of riding out a hurricane in a wooden sailing ship was often described by survivors as being trapped inside a giant drum while giants beat it with massive hammers. The famous pirate ship Whydah Galley met its end in exactly such a storm off Cape Cod in 1717. Captain Samuel Black, Sam Bellamy's crew, found themselves caught in a violent nor'easter that drove their heavily laden ship toward the dangerous shoals of the Cape Cod coast. Despite their experience and skill, they were helpless against the storm's power. Of the 146 men aboard the ship, only to survive the wreck, while the rest either drowned immediately or died of exposure on the beach. The widow's destruction illustrates how quickly fortune could turn against even the most successful pirate crews. Bellamy's men had been celebrating their recent captures and the treasure they carried when the storm struck. Within hours, they went from being wealthy, successful pirates to corpses washing up on a hostile shore. The few survivors faced immediate arrest and execution, making their rescue from the sea merely a postponement of their ultimate fate. Navigation during storms became nearly impossible, as pirates could untake celestial readings through the clouds and had no way to determine their precise location. Ships could be driven hundreds of miles off course without their crews realizing it, often finding themselves in dangerous waters or approaching hostile coastlines with no warning. The lack of accurate charts for many areas made this situation even more perilous, as pirates might discover deadly reefs or shoals only when their ship ran aground on them. Shipwrecks did not always result in immediate death. Sometimes they created prolonged suffering that made drowning seem merciful by comparison. Pirates who survived the initial wreck might find themselves stranded on uninhabited islands or hostile coasts with no supplies, fresh water, or means of rescue. These survivors faced slow death from exposure, thirst, and starvation, often watching their comrades die one by one while they awaited their own inevitable end. The process of wrecking itself was a terrifying experience that could unfold over hours or happen in mere minutes. When ships ran aground on reefs or rocky shores, the impact would often punch holes through the hull, causing water to rush in faster than it could be pumped out. The crew would realize their situation was hopeless, but be powerless to prevent the destruction of their vessel and likely their own deaths. As the ship took on water and began to sink, pirates faced the choice between staying with the vessel and risking drowning when it went under, or jumping into rough seas where their chances of survival were minimal. Those who could unswim, and many sailors of the era never learned, had to choose between certain death and probable death, with neither option offering much hope. The survivors of shipwrecks often faced additional horrors on shore. Local populations were rarely sympathetic to pirates who washed up on their beaches, viewing them as dangerous criminals who deserved no mercy. Many wreck survivors were immediately captured and turned over to authorities for trial and execution, making their escape from the sea merely a brief reprieve from their ultimate fate. Even when survivors reached uninhabited shores, their ordeal was often just beginning. Without tools, weapons, or supplies, they had to find ways to obtain fresh water, food, and shelter, using only their bare hands and whatever materials washed ashore from their wrecked ship. Many died of exposure or thirst within days of reaching land, too weakened by their ordeal to successfully forage for survival necessities. The constant threat of shipwreck influenced every aspect of pirate navigation and behavior. Experienced pirates learned to read weather signs and avoid dangerous waters whenever possible. But the very nature of their profession often forced them to take risks that prudent sailors would avoid. The need to chase merchant vessels, escape pursuing naval ships, or reach safe harbors quickly often meant sailing in dangerous conditions or unfamiliar waters where the risk of wreck was significantly higher. Pirates also faced the unique danger of having their own success work against them during storms. Ships loaded with heavy treasure became much more difficult to handle in rough weather, as the additional weight made them sit lower in the water and respond more slowly to steering. The very gold and silver they had risked their lives to capture could become the cause of their death if it prevented their ship from riding out a storm safely. Life expectancy, a numbers game with death. The mathematics of pirate mortality tell a stark story that demolishes any romantic notions about the sustainability of life on the account. Pirates didn't grow old gracefully, they died young, violently, and in numbers that reflected the fundamental impossibility of their chosen profession. The statistical reality of pirate life expectancy reveals a profession so deadly that it functioned more as an extended form of suicide than a viable career choice. The average pirate career lasted approximately 2 years, not because men chose to retire after brief service, but because they were dead. Most pirates died before reaching their 30th birthday, with many perishing in their early 20s after only months at sea. These weren't accidents or unfortunate exceptions. They represented the normal, expected outcome for anyone who chose the pirate life. The most comprehensive analysis of pirate mortality comes from examining the fates of known pirates from the Golden Age. Of the hundreds of documented pirates from this period, fewer than 5% died of natural causes. The rest met violent ends through combat, execution, disease, or maritime disasters. This mortality rate was unprecedented, even in an age when life was generally brutal and short. Edward Teach, the infamous Blackbeard, exemplified the typical pirate lifespan and death. Despite his fearsome reputation and apparent success, his pirating career lasted only about 3 years before he died in battle at approximately age 38. His death came not from old age or retirement, but from a coordinated naval attack that left him with 20 sword wounds and 5 gunshot injuries before he finally succumbed. The circumstances of Blackbeard's death illustrate how even the most successful pirates remained constantly vulnerable to violent ends. He was unambushed by surprise or betrayed by his own crew. He was killed in open combat by a smaller naval force that should theoretically have been outmatched. His death demonstrated that reputation, experience, and success provided no real protection against the fundamental dangers of pirate life. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, and considered by many to be the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, managed to live slightly longer than average before meeting his inevitable end. Roberts captured over 400 ships during his career, amassed considerable wealth, and commanded multiple vessels at the height of his power. Yet, he still died in battle at approximately age 40, killed by grapeshot during a naval engagement off the coast of West Africa. Roberts's death highlights the paradox of pirate success, though. More successful a pirate became, the more attention he attracted from naval forces and colonial governments determined to eliminate him. Success in piracy was ultimately self-defeating, as it made the pirate a priority target for increasingly powerful enemies. The most successful pirates didn't retire wealthy, they died wealthy, leaving their treasure to be claimed by their killers. Calico Jack Rackham's story demonstrates how quickly pirate fortunes could change from success to catastrophe. Rackham commanded a crew that included the famous female pirates Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and he enjoyed a period of successful raiding in the Caribbean. Yet, His entire career lasted only about 2 years before he was captured and executed at age 37. His crew's final battle lasted mere hours, ending careers that had taken months to establish. The youth of most pirates reflected both the physical demands of their profession and the limited opportunities available to join crews. Piracy required men who could handle the brutal physical labor of sailing, fighting, and surviving in harsh conditions. Older men typically lacked either the stamina for such work or the desperation that drove younger men to such extreme choices. The recruitment patterns of pirate crews also favored young men who had fewer attachments and responsibilities that might prevent them from abandoning civilized life entirely. Young sailors who had experienced the brutality of merchant service or naval impressment were more likely to view piracy as an attractive alternative, while older men with families and established lives had more to lose by turning criminal. Disease-claimed pirate lives with ruthless efficiency, often striking down men in their prime who had survived multiple battles and dangerous voyages. The confined conditions aboard ship meant that when infectious diseases gained a foothold, they could sweep through entire crews with devastating speed. Scurvy alone probably killed more pirates than all other causes combined, claiming victims regardless of their fighting skills, experience, or luck. The psychological toll of pirate life accelerated both physical and mental deterioration in ways that shortened lifespans beyond what might be expected from violence alone. The constant stress of living as hunted criminals, combined with poor nutrition, harsh living conditions, and frequent violence, aged pirates prematurely and left them vulnerable to diseases that healthier men might have survived. Execution represented a significant portion of documented pirate deaths, reflecting the determined efforts of colonial governments to eliminate piracy through systematic judicial murder. Pirates who survived long enough to be captured rarely escaped the gallows, as colonial courts showed little mercy to men who had disrupted maritime commerce and threatened colonial prosperity. The execution process itself was designed to serve as a public warning against the pirate life. Condemned pirates were often hanged at low tide near major ports, where their bodies would remain visible to incoming ships as a reminder of the consequences of piracy. Some were gibbeted left, hanging in iron cages until their remains completely decomposed, creating permanent monuments to the futility of criminal careers at sea. The few pirates who managed to survive long enough to attempt retirement faced ongoing dangers that continued to threaten their lives. Former pirates could never completely escape their past, as their reputations followed them wherever they went. Colonial authorities actively hunted former pirates, offering rewards for information about their whereabouts and arresting them, years or even decades after their supposed retirement. The mathematical reality of pirate mortality meant that crews experienced constant turnover as death-claimed members and new recruits replaced them. A pirate ship was less a stable organization than a revolving door of desperate men, most of whom would be dead within months of joining. This constant turnover prevented the development of the stable, experienced crews that might have had better chances of long-term survival. The legendary pirates who achieved fame and notoriety represented the successful exceptions rather than typical examples of pirate life expectancy. For every Blackbeard or Black Bart who achieved temporary success, dozens of unknown pirates died anonymously in their first months at sea. leaving no historical record beyond occasional mentions in colonial newspapers or court records. The psychological toll, the mental and emotional strain of pirate life created psychological wounds that often proved more devastating than physical injuries. Pirates lived in a constant state of stress that would overwhelm modern individuals accustomed to safety, security, and predictable routines. The combination of ever-present danger, social isolation, moral degradation, and traumatic experiences created mental health challenges that these men had no framework to understand or address. The fundamental contradiction of pirate life seeking freedom through actions that made them perpetual fugitives created a psychological burden that wore down even the strongest personalities. Pirates could never relax, never feel safe, and never enjoy the fruits of their success without constantly looking over their shoulders for the naval forces or colonial authorities who sought their destruction. This hypervigilance exhausted mental resources and left pirates in a permanent state of anxiety that affected their judgment and decision-making abilities. The isolation from normal society was particularly damaging to pirates' psychological well-being. Once they raised the black flag, they could never again walk freely in civilized company without risking recognition and arrest. They were cut off from family, friends, and the social connections that provide emotional support and mental stability. This isolation forced pirates to find all their human interaction within their criminal crew, creating unhealthy dependency relationships that often turned toxic under stress. The moral weight of their actions created additional psychological burdens that many pirates struggled to bear. Despite the romanticized image of pirates as freedom fighters or rebels against oppression, most were intelligent enough to recognize that they were common criminals who made their living by threatening and often killing innocent people. The cognitive dissonance between their self-image and their actions created internal conflicts that manifested as depression, anxiety, and self-destructive behavior. Pirates who committed or witnessed extreme acts of violence often suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had participated in torture, murder, or cannibalism carried those experiences with them, reliving traumatic moments through nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts, without any understanding of trauma, psychology, or therapeutic interventions. These men had no way to process their experiences or find relief from their symptoms. The constant proximity to death shaped pirates' psychological outlook in profound ways. They lived with the knowledge that each day might be their last, either from violence, disease, accident, or execution. This awareness of mortality created a fatalistic mindset that influenced their behavior and decision-making. Some pirates responded by living recklessly, engaging in dangerous behavior because they assumed death was inevitable anyway. Others became paralyzed by fear, unable to function effectively in the dangerous situations their profession demanded. Sleep disturbances were common among pirates, though they lacked the vocabulary to describe what we would now call insomnia, nightmares, or sleep anxiety. The combination of physical discomfort, constant noise, and psychological stress made restful sleep nearly impossible. Pirates often had to sleep while remaining partially alert for danger, creating a state of chronic sleep deprivation that affected their mental acuity and emotional stability. The democratic governance structure of pirate crews, while providing some benefits, also created unique psychological stresses. Pirates had to navigate complex social dynamics where today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, where collective decision-making could devolve into bitter arguments, and where personal conflicts had life or death consequences. The pressure of constantly managing relationships in such a volatile environment was exhausting and contributed to the mental deterioration of many crew members. Alcohol abuse was rampant among pirates, serving as their primary method of self-medication for psychological distress. When supplies were available, pirates would drink heavily to escape their reality temporarily. But this coping mechanism created additional problems. Alcohol dependency made pirates less effective in dangerous situations, contributed to violence between crew members, and worsened their physical health problems. The lack of privacy and personal space aboard ship created additional psychological strain. Pirates could never escape from their crewmates, never find moments of solitude for reflection or recovery from stress. This constant social exposure was particularly difficult for men dealing with trauma, depression, or anxiety, as they had no opportunity to withdraw from social demands when their emotional resources were exhausted. The uncertainty of their situation contributed to chronic stress that affected every aspect of pirates' mental health. They never knew when their next meal would come, when they might be attacked, when disease might strike, or when colonial forces might locate and destroy them. This constant uncertainty made it impossible to plan for the future or find psychological stability in routine and predictability. Many pirates displayed symptoms that we would now recognize as depression, persistent sadness, loss of interest in activities, feelings of hopelessness, and thoughts of death. The combination of their dangerous lifestyle, moral conflicts, and social isolation created perfect conditions for depressive episodes that could last for weeks or months. Without effective treatments or even recognition of depression as a medical condition, these men suffered in silence while their mental health continued to deteriorate. The competitive nature of pirate crews created additional psychological pressures. Pirates had to constantly prove their worth to their crewmates through displays of courage, skill, or ruthlessness. This pressure to perform could lead to anxiety disorders, as men worried about their status within the group and their ability to maintain the respect of their peers. Why anyone would choose this life? Given the overwhelming evidence of suffering, disease, violence, and early death that characterized pirate life, the question arises, why would anyone voluntarily choose such an existence? The answer lies in understanding the equally horrific alternatives available to common men in the 17th and 18th centuries, when legitimate maritime careers often provided conditions that were only marginally better than piracy, and sometimes significantly worse. The Royal Navy, supposedly representing legitimate service to crown and country, was notorious for its brutal treatment of common sailors. Naval discipline was enforced through floggings that could cripple or kill, and the pressed men who formed the bulk of naval crews were essentially slaves who had been kidnapped from their homes and forced into service. The British practice of impressment allowed naval recruiting parties to seize any able-bodied man they could find, dragging him away from family and livelihood to serve 4 years without hope of escape. Life expectancy for pre-siege naval sailors was approximately 2 years, identical to that of pirates, but without any of the compensating benefits. Naval sailors received minimal pay that was often withheld for months or years, leaving their families destitute while the men risked their lives for their country's benefit. The food was equally poor, the living conditions just as crowded and unsanitary, and the medical care equally primitive. Yet naval sailors had no voice in their governance, no say in their destinations, and no share in any prizes their ship might capture. Merchant service offered slightly better conditions than naval service, but still presented a life of hardship with minimal reward. Merchant sailors worked under arbitrary captains who could impose harsh discipline for minor infractions. They received low wages that barely covered their basic needs, and they had no protection against abusive officers or dangerous working conditions. Career advancement was limited, and most merchant sailors could expect to remain common seamen for their entire working lives. The economic conditions of the late 17th and early 18th centuries created large populations of desperate men who had few legal options for improving their circumstances. Colonial expansion and frequent wars had displaced traditional communities, leaving thousands of men without stable employment or social support. For these displaced populations, piracy offered opportunities that simply didn't exist in legitimate society. Piracy provided immediate economic rewards that were impossible to obtain through honest work. A single successful raid on a merchant ship could provide a common pirate with more wealth than he might earn in years of legitimate labor. While these riches were temporary and often quickly spent, they offered a taste of prosperity that was completely unavailable to men of their social class through legal means. The democratic governance of pirate crews appealed to men who had never experienced political participation in their entire lives. Common sailors in legitimate service had no voice in decisions that affected their lives. They followed orders without question or faced severe punishment. Pirate crews, by contrast, elected their officers, voted on major decisions, and could remove leaders who failed to serve their interests. For men accustomed to powerlessness, this democratic participation represented genuine liberation. The racial and ethnic equality found on pirate ships was revolutionary in an age dominated by rigid social hierarchies. Former slaves could become respected crew members on pirate ships, while legitimate society offered them only continued bondage. Poor whites could sail alongside freed blacks as equals, sharing dangers and rewards without regard to their backgrounds. This egalitarian environment attracted men who had been marginalized or oppressed in conventional society. Religious tolerance aboard pirate ships provided refuge for men fleeing religious persecution. In an era when religious differences could result in imprisonment or death, pirate crews welcomed members regardless of their faith or lack thereof. Catholics could serve alongside Protestants, and religious minorities found acceptance that was impossible in their home communities. The compensation system for injured pirates was more generous than anything available in legitimate maritime service. Pirates who lost limbs or suffered other serious injuries received substantial payments that could support them for years. Legitimate sailors who suffered similar injuries were typically discharged without compensation, left to beg or starve as society's unwanted casualties. For young men facing a lifetime of grinding poverty with no hope of advancement, piracy offered the possibility of dramatic change in circumstances. The chance of dying young was balanced against the certainty of living poor, and many chose the risk of early death over the guarantee of prolonged suffering. Their logic was simple: better to live briefly as free men than to die slowly as slaves. The reputation and notoriety that came with piracy also appealed to men who had lived anonymous lives without recognition or respect. Pirates could become famous throughout the Atlantic world, their names known from London to Jamaica. This fame might be short-lived and ultimately fatal, but it provided a form of immortality that was completely unavailable to common laborers or sailors. The adventure and excitement of pirate life, despite its dangers, offered an escape from the crushing boredom and routine of legitimate work. Pirates traveled to exotic locations, encountered diverse cultures, and experienced adventures that made for compelling stories. Even if these adventures often ended in death or disaster, they provided experiences that most men of their era could never hope to achieve. Conclusion: as we surface from these dark waters of historical truth, the romanticized image of pirate life lies shattered like the hull of a storm-wrecked ship. We've journeyed through the genuine experiences of men who chose the black flag, and we've seen how that choice led not to adventure and freedom, but to suffering, degradation, and almost certain death. The pirates of the Golden Age were the swashbuckling heroes of our imaginations. They were desperate men trapped in a nightmare of their own making, trading brief moments of apparent freedom for lives of constant terror and premature death. The diseases that ravaged their bodies, the primitive medical procedures that often killed more than they cured, the violence that permeated every aspect of their existence, and the psychological toll of living as hunted criminals, all combined to create an existence that would break most modern individuals within weeks. These men endured conditions that we can barely imagine, sustained only by the hope that their suffering might lead to prosperity and freedom that almost never materialized. The statistical reality of pirate life and average career, lasting 2 years and death before 30, speaks to the fundamental impossibility of their chosen profession. Pirates didn't retire wealthy and respected. They died young and violent deaths, leaving behind no legacy except cautionary tales and scattered bones on distant beaches. Yet understanding why men chose this path helps us comprehend the desperation that characterized life for common people in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Golden Age of Piracy was really a symptom of social conditions, so harsh that men willingly embraced almost certain death for the slim chance of temporary improvement in their circumstances. The pirate stories remind us of our own good fortune in living during an era when legitimate opportunities exist for those willing to pursue them, when medical care can cure diseases that once meant certain death, and when social systems provide at least minimal protection for the vulnerable. The warmth, safety, and security we take for granted would seem miraculous to men who lived in constant fear of scurvy, violence, and the gallows. Their tragic stories serve as monuments to human endurance and desperation, showing how far men will go when pushed beyond the limits of conventional society. In understanding their suffering, we gain perspective on our own lives and appreciation for the civilization that protects us from the savage realities that once dominated human existence. So, the next time you see a romanticized portrayal of pirate life, remember the truth that lies beneath the fiction. Remember the men who died screaming under the surgeon's saw, who wasted away from scurvy in the stinking holds of their ships, who faced execution with resigned acceptance because they knew their choices had made death inevitable. Their real story is far more powerful than any romantic fantasy. It's a testament to both the resilience of the human spirit and the terrible cost of desperation. Before you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to appreciate the simple luxuries that surround Euclid water. Nutritious food, safety from violence, medical care when needed, and the freedom to plan for a future that extends beyond tomorrow. These are gifts that the pirates of the Golden Age could never enjoy, luxuries worth more than all the treasure they ever sought. If you found this journey into the dark reality of pirate life fascinating, consider subscribing to explore more hidden truths from history. Like this video if you enjoyed this deep dive into the authentic experiences of these desperate men. And let me know in the comments where you re-watching from and what other historical myths you'd liked to see examined. Sometimes the real stories are far more compelling than the fiction, even when, or perhaps especially when, they reveal the brutal realities that our ancestors endured in their struggle for survival.